Have you heard the myth that snakes need a small, confined enclosure in order to feel comfortable or less stressed? I personally think that's a myth. I hear it all the time. I do really think it's an excuse that people use in order to stack 50 snakes in one room. Okay, so I'm making a few changes to my reptile room. If you watched the original video where I made the glass enclosure out of old windows for my Brazilian rainbow boa, you know that in that video I mentioned that I would eventually need to upgrade her to something a little bit longer, so that's what I've done here. I found this 4x2 PVC enclosure on my local classifieds and I just scooped it up. I don't have a ton of time right now, so I didn't have time to build anything for her, and this was a really good deal. Plus it came with a radiant heat panel and a thermostat. So we're gonna set this up today. A few other changes. I dropped this shelf of this top boa enclosure, which I think looks a lot better. It was unbelievably dangerous and sketchy when I did it, so I didn't film it because I did it by myself. Remember, my girlfriend helped me the first time. This time she had her wisdom teeth pulled out on the same day I was doing this, and I don't know why, but for some reason she was not in the mood to help me move enclosures, but I just wanted to do it anyway, so I did it. I was able to drop it down a couple inches, so I think it looks a lot cleaner. Obviously with this 4-foot enclosure, I don't have room for both of my geckos, the Exoterras, on this middle shelf anymore. So I've moved one gecko up to the top rack over there, which you can see. So yeah, today's video, we're just gonna set up this PVC enclosure. I'll show you how to set up the thermostat under the radiant heat panel and whatnot and get everything balanced. We've done similar things before, and then we're also gonna add some lighting into it. This has no lighting, so we're gonna do that. And then at the very end of the video, I'm gonna make an announcement about what I'm going to do with the original glass enclosure, the one that's made out of windows. I have a really interesting idea and I'm excited to do it, so that will be a video in the future. So if you want to hear what that is, make sure you stay right to the end. And then in the time being, let's get going on this one. All right, so we're gonna start with the lighting. And by the way, this is, I'm not sure the brand of this enclosure, but it's a pretty standard 4x2 by 16 inches high PVC enclosure. I mean, it looks very similar to anything that you might find where you're from. I did use saran wrap to block the vents just because this is a rainbow boa and the humidity does need to be high. And even though PVC enclosures are good for maintaining humidity, it's still not. It is so dry where I live in the winter that I need to block up almost all the vents. In the summer, I'll probably have to pull that off. So for lighting, I just went with standard strip LED lighting. This is pretty commonly used in PVC enclosures. I bought this off of Amazon for I think $25 Canadian, so it's very cheap. I have it posted in the description below so you guys can see what brand it is. But basically just comes in a giant spool, and you can cut it on these black lines for the length that you want. And it does come with an adhesive back, so that just sticks on to wherever you like. But the reason I went with this brand particularly because it comes with this controller, and the controller allows me to turn it on and off, which I don't really care about because it will be on a timer anyway, but it also allows me to dim the light here. And by itself, the full blast, these LEDs are actually quite bright, and I want the ability to just dim it back just a little bit so I'm not just slamming light into the enclosure, because I think it is maybe a bit too bright. So we're gonna stick this on right now. So I'm just gonna feed the end of the LED into this hole that was previously drilled by the other owner. So here's the radiant heat panel that came with the enclosure. This is what looks to be a Reptile Basics heat panel, or radiant heat panel, so I assume that's what it is. And I think it's probably the 80-watt panel. It's about the size of an 80-watt panel. So the thermostat that came with this enclosure when I purchased it is the Zilla Temperature Controller. I don't love these, and I don't necessarily recommend them. As you can see, it's really tough to set a specific temperature. It's just sort of this dial type setup, and the temperature probe is absolutely massive on these things. I don't know how you could use it for anything other than a radiant heat panel, because it would never fit under a tank or under the tank heater. But since I'm using this for a radiant heat panel, I don't mind using something that's not super accurate. The radiant heat panels are typically a lot safer than an under the tank heater, so this will work just fine for the scenario. But I do want to fasten it to the side of the enclosure, so I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. I'm just going to use these Velcro strips and Velcro it down. That way it's easy to access. So you can see there is this hole drilled for the probe. Again, this is a huge probe, so it barely squeezed through that hole. And I'm actually just gonna let the probe hang underneath the radiant heat panel, just like this. That way it'll get a good taste of the air here and it will have no problem controlling the temperature. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the thermostat to a timer. I really like having night drop temperatures for my animals, and this will allow me to kill the heat at night and then have it come back on during the day. Now in the winter I'll probably cut it off much earlier, have the entire night, maybe from like 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. no heat, and in the summer maybe I'll just cut it out for like 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the night, so there's still a night drop, just not as significant. So in terms of how to actually set up this temperature controller, it's very simple. You have two lights. You have the green light, which just tells you that the power is being supplied to the controller itself. And then you have the red light, which tells you that whatever the heat source you're using is on. If the red light's on, that means the heat source is on. You have the temperature gradient kind of up here. The top has Fahrenheit, the bottom has Celsius. I don't think this is very accurate, and so that doesn't mean, so what you don't want to do is just go, okay, I want a hot spot of 80 degrees, I'll just set this to 80 and I'll be good to go. This is probably not very accurate. Instead, what I want to do is set it for 80 and then have thermometers set up on the inside of the enclosure, or maybe use an infrared temperature gun and continue to measure it, and then I'll figure out, okay, maybe 80 degrees is giving me a hot spot of 86 or something that's too hot, and then I'll turn it down. So you just have to play with it that way. This is just a guideline. It has nothing to do with the temperature on the inside of the enclosure. It's very important that you balance your temperatures with thermometers on the inside of the enclosure. So as I said, we're just going to test out the temperatures. I'd like to know the ambient temperatures, that one's up there, and then I also want to know how hot the radiant heat panel gets the inside of the hide. I'm just curious to see if it creates a nice hot spot for her or what. So I'll wait a couple hours, I'll close it up, and then we'll check on it in a little bit. Okay, so it's a couple hours later and I'm happy with the temperatures. I was able to get the ambient at around 85. The radiant heat panel has now turned off, but I was able to get the ambient around 84, 85, and inside the hide was about 82, 83. So I'm perfectly happy with that. So we can go ahead and start setting this thing up. So it's a couple days later, and so far I'm really liking the way this enclosure is working. She's already been out and about at nighttime exploring, so hopefully I'm cutting in some shots right now of her doing that. The humidity is being maintained really well. It's about 95%. On the warm side, I'm sitting right around 84, 85 degrees, and inside the hide is a little bit cooler, around 80 or 81 degrees. And the cool side of the enclosure is at about 77, 78 during the day, and then at nighttime everything cools down to about 72. It's winter here, so I let them cool down a little bit more in the winter than I normally would in the summer. Even 72 might seem a little bit cool for some of you guys, but I typically keep my animals cooler than most people. I find that I watch the behavior of my animals, and I find, like right now, both of my boas are on their cool side, which is about 70 degrees or 72 degrees, and that's just where they seem to hang out. They do have a warm side of about 85, 86 degrees with a hot spot of 88. I rarely see them over there. So I kind of just play it with it and see how my animals respond, and a lot of the time I'm finding my boas, both the regular common boas and the Brazilian rainbow boas, tend to sit on the cooler side. And if you want to watch a really neat video, head over to Dave Kaufman's channel. He's done a couple of videos where he's actually in the Amazon rainforest and he's looking for both the common boas as well as the Brazilian rainbow boas. And he's done a really cool job finding wild specimens and really looking at how they live in the wild to compare how we treat them in the hobby. One of the things that was pretty neat was in the rainforest where the Brazilian rainbow boas are found, he was measuring the floor temperature, the forest floor temperature around 82 degrees only, which is a far cry from, you see a lot of care sheets looking into the 90 degrees, which I always felt was too warm, and that kind of confirmed my suspicions that the rainforest floor is actually not that warm. Around 82, 83 degrees is gonna be perfect. So anyway, the setup is working really well. One thing I want to add is leaf litter, and that was one of the things that I got from watching Dave Kaufman's video. Is obviously there's leaf litter all over the rainforest, and the Brazilian rainbow boas in particular like to hide underneath it. So I'm going to do that. I don't want to go buy leaf litter from the pet store because it's insanely expensive for leaves. I'm gonna go collect leaves from outside. Unfortunately, it's winter right now, so I'm gonna have to wait until the spring, or most likely the summer, until I can go pick some good leaves, and then I'll show you guys how to sanitize those and add them to the enclosure. I think that'll be a really nice touch and also a little bit of enrichment for her. But anyway, that's this. I'm really happy with the way this turned out. Let's take a look at my ideas for the other enclosure. Have you heard the myth that snakes need a small, confined enclosure in order to feel comfortable or less stressed? I personally think that's a myth. I hear it all the time. I do really think it's an excuse that people use in order to stack 50 snakes in one room. You'll recognize this as the original glass enclosure that I had for my Brazilian rainbow boa. That all the stuff in here is just storage, it's just decor that I eventually will use to scape this enclosure. But I had this brainwave last week, and I thought, well, what am I gonna do with this empty enclosure? If you own reptiles, you know that having an empty enclosure is very dangerous because that means you might get another animal. I'm not getting another animal. But what I thought I could do is put my jungle carpet python in here. Right now he's very small. He's not even a year old. He's like 60 grams at the most. He's about that big curled up. But I thought, why not put him in this giant enclosure? And it's not a giant enclosure. It's only 3 feet tall by 2 feet wide by 2 feet deep. But for him, he's so small that it would be considered a giant enclosure. And it would definitely fall into that realm of being way too big for the animal. You're gonna stress it out and it's not gonna eat. Typically when an animal is very stressed, that's the first thing they stop doing, is they stop eating, and that's how you know when they're stressed out. So I feel as long as I set this up in a enriching way with lots of hiding spots, lots of places to climb, I think the carpet python's actually going to do quite well in here. Now, this is an experiment. It's kind of a risk for me as well, because I don't know exactly, maybe he will get stressed out. Maybe this is too much space and I'm going to have to come up with something different. But I want to try this because I really think it would do good as an anecdotal piece of evidence that snakes don't need small confined spaces in order to feel comfortable. In actuality, I think it's probably the opposite, considering the more exercise and whatnot that he can get in this enclosure. Now, I wanted to set it up arboreal because jungle carpet pythons, or carpet pythons in general, tend to be slightly more arboreal snakes. They do spend lots of time on the ground as well, but since he is so small, still the 2 feet by 2 feet on the bottom is still plenty of floor space for him. And if he does end up spending a ton of time on the floor, I'll just flip it back to the landscape orientation, so he'll have more floor space for him. But for now, I'd like to see how he responds to this extra height. If he's using the height, we might as well keep it there, and then eventually he will be too big for this as well. But this will give him a ton of time in the same enclosure to feel comfortable and to grow and to get stronger by climbing and whatnot. So I do want to give him a few more weeks of growth just to make sure that he's not too small to try to escape through any seams or anything. He's probably already there. I just want to be safe. But I think this is going to be a really interesting project. If you're not subscribed to the channel, definitely subscribe, because it's probably going to be the next video or the next project that I end up working on. And we'll see what this ends up turning out. I do think that we can do a lot towards kind of busting this myth and showing people that that a small enclosure is not required for a snake to feel comfortable. And if anything's gonna prove it, it will be this, considering how small this guy is compared to how big the enclosure is. So I'm very excited to start working on this. Again, it's the next project I'm gonna be working on. If you have any suggestions for how to escape this, or any ideas that you would for climbing branches and whatnot, please put it in the comments below. It will be the next thing I'm working on, and we'll see you guys next time.